Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Chapter 1. The Door. Mr. John Utterson was a lawyer, and he lived in London. He seemed to be a cold man without feeling. He never smiled, and he spoke only when it was necessary. But people liked him. There was something in his eyes that showed kindness. It showed his understanding of other people. Men and women came to him about the law, and he helped them all. It didn't matter who they were. He lived a quiet and simple life. He enjoyed the theater, but he didn't visit it anymore. His friends were people from his family, and very old friends from his old school. Then there was Mr. Enfield. Other people could see no reason for Mr. Utterson and Mr. Richard Enfield to be friends. Mr. Enfield was quite different from Mr. Utterson. He was younger and enjoyed going to the theater, to parties, and good restaurants. "Why are they friends?" people asked. "What do they talk about when they are together?" And the reply was, if you see them on their Sunday walks, they never say anything. They don't seem to enjoy themselves. But the two men thought that their Sunday walks were an important part of the weekend. They enjoyed being together, and they enjoyed the walks. But they were often silent walks. On one of their walks, the two men found themselves in a narrow street in one of the busier parts of London. It was a quiet street on a Sunday, but during the week the little shops on each side were very busy. Because the shops were successful, they were clean and brightly painted. The road was clean. It was a pleasant street to walk along. Near one end of this street there was a break in the line of shops. There was a narrow entrance to a courtyard, and next to it was the windowless end of a tall, dark, ugly house. A door in this wall was unpainted and needed repair. Old men sometimes slept in the doorway, and small boys sometimes played on the steps and wrote their names on the door with their pocket knives. Mr. Enfield and the lawyer were on the other side of the street, but Mr. Enfield pointed to it with his walking stick. "Have you ever noticed that door before, John?" he asked. "Yes. Ugly, isn't it?" replied Mr. Utterson. "Every time I pass it," said Mr. Enfield, "I think about a day last winter. A very strange thing happened." "Oh," said Mr. Utterson, "what was it?" Chapter 2. Mr. Enfield's Story. One dark morning I was on my way home at about 3 o'clock. At first I walked a very long way without seeing anyone. Everybody was asleep. The street lights were lit, but the street was empty and silent. Suddenly I saw two people. One was a little man who was walking quickly towards the street corner. The other was a little girl. She was about 8 or 9 years old, I think. She was running as quickly as she could towards the same corner. Naturally, she ran into the little man. And then I saw something terrible. The girl fell down, and the man calmly walked on her. He stepped on her body. She cried out, of course, but he didn't stop or turn round. He just walked away. He wasn't acting like a man, more like a mindless machine. Then the girl started screaming. I shouted and ran after the man. At last I caught him by the neck and brought him back. Already there was a group of people round the crying child, her family, and some of her neighbors. "Get a doctor," said somebody, and one of the neighbors hurried away. He was quite calm, the man who stepped on the child. He didn't try to escape, but he looked at me once and my blood ran cold. I hated him. The people round the girl were soon joined by the doctor. The girl was not hurt very much, only frightened, really, the doctor said. But there was something very unusual about it all. I felt an immediate hate for the man that I was holding. The child's family hated him too, and that was natural. But the doctor was not like us. He was the usual cold, calm, scientific man. But every time he looked at the man, I saw him turn sick and white. He wants to kill him too, I thought. I understood what was in the doctor's mind. He looked at me. He knew what was in mine. We can't kill the man even if we want to, we agreed. But we promised to make as much trouble for him as we could. "We'll tell all our friends about this," we told the man. "Everyone in London will hear about it." And all the time we were keeping the women away from him. They were wild and dangerous because they were so angry. I never saw so many hate-filled faces. And there was the man in the middle. He was frightened, but he smiled an ugly smile and did not move. "If you want money," he said, "tell me. Nobody wants trouble with people like you." We told him to give £100 to the child and her family. At first he didn't want to agree to this, but the little crowd round him looked dangerous, and at last he said, "All right, I'll pay." Next, we had to get the money. And where do you think he took us? To that ugly place with the door. He pulled the key out of his pocket, unlocked the door, and went in. We waited outside. After a time he came out with £10 in money and a cheque for the rest. The cheque was signed, and the signature surprised me. It was the name of a famous man. I can't tell you the name, but you probably know it well. "I don't like this," I said. "You walk through a door like that at 4 o'clock in the morning and come out of it with another man's cheque for nearly £100. It's very unusual." He smiled his ugly smile again and answered, "You don't need to worry. I'll stay with you until the banks open, and then I'll get the money with the cheque." The child's father, the man, and I went to my house and waited there until the morning. After breakfast, we all went to the bank together with the cheque, and the bank paid the money without question. Chapter 3. The Cheque. Mr. Utterson looked shocked. "Oh dear," he said, "that's a terrible story." "Yes, I agree," said Mr. Enfield. "It's a shocking story. Nobody would like the unpleasant man who hurt the girl. But another man signed the cheque, and he's exactly the opposite. A really fine, honest man, and very famous for his good work." "What is the name of the man who walked over the child?" asked Mr. Utterson. "His name is Mr. Hyde," said Mr. Enfield. "And the man who signed the cheque? Does he live in that house?" asked Mr. Utterson. "Do you know?" "Behind that door?" Mr. Enfield asked. "No, he doesn't. His house is in a square, but I don't remember the name of the square. The place behind the door doesn't really seem like a house. There are 3 windows on the first floor of the courtyard. They're always shut, but they are clean. Somebody lives there. But the houses are all near together round the courtyard. You can't be sure how many there are. there doesn't seem to be another door, and nobody uses the door that I showed you, except the man that I have told you about." Mr. Utterson walked in silence. It was clear that he was thinking. At last he said, "Are you sure that he used a key?" Mr. Enfield was clearly surprised. "Well," he began. The lawyer continued, "I'm sorry, it must seem a strange question, but there is a reason for it. I already know the name of the man who signed the check." Chapter 4. Who is Mr. Hyde? That evening, Mr. Utterson ate his dinner without much interest. He was not really hungry. There was too much on his mind. After dinner he usually read a book until midnight and then went to bed. But that night he took a light and went into his office. There he opened his safe and took out an envelope. On it were the words, "Dr. Jekyll's will." He sat down and began to read the will with a worried look on his face. The will was in Dr. Jekyll's writing. Mr. Utterson refused to help the doctor when he wrote it. The lawyer had to keep it for the doctor. It was his job. But he didn't like the will. The will was clear. If Henry Jekyll dies, his house and all his money passes into the hands of his friend and helper, Edward Hyde. And if Dr. Jekyll disappears for 3 months, the same Edward Hyde will own everything immediately. The lawyer disliked this will. He didn't like it as a lawyer, and it made him angry as a person. He liked people to do things in an ordinary way. "My dislike was very strong when Hyde was only a name," he said to himself. "Now I know some very unpleasant things about the man with that name, and it makes it worse. I thought that Jekyll was mad. Now I'm beginning to think he's afraid." After some time, he put the will back into his safe. Then he put on a coat and hat and went out into the cold night. He went to Cavendish Square to visit his friend, the famous Dr. Lanyon. "If someone knows something about this, it is Lanyon," he thought. He soon reached Cavendish Square and his friend's house. Dr. Lanyon's servant was glad to see Mr. Utterson, and took the lawyer straight to the dining room. Dr. Lanyon was finishing his dinner. The doctor was a happy, healthy man with a red face. When he saw Mr. Utterson, he jumped up. "It's good to see you, Utterson," he said. "Sit down and make yourself comfortable." They always enjoyed their visits. After a little general talk, the lawyer spoke about Dr. Jekyll. "You and I, Lanyon, are surely Henry Jekyll's 2 oldest friends," he said. "It is a pity that their friends are not younger," said Dr. Lanyon, smiling. "But yes, we probably are his oldest friends. But I don't see him very often now." "Oh, is that right? I'm surprised to hear that," said Mr. Utterson. "I thought that you were both interested in the same scientific work." "We were," Dr. Lanyon replied. "But then Henry Jekyll began to have some strange ideas that I could not agree with. He began to go wrong, or that is my opinion." "How?" "Wrong in the mind, I think. Of course I'm still interested in him." Utterson waited for a minute, then asked, "Did you ever meet a man that he knows, a man with the name of Hyde?" "Hyde?" said Lanyon quickly. "No, I never heard Henry Jekyll say that name." And that was all the information that Mr. Utterson went home with that evening. But Enfield's story didn't leave his mind. He could not stop thinking about it, and he slept badly that night. "I must see this Mr. Hyde," he thought. "I must see this man that Enfield hates so strongly. The man seems to have power over Henry Jekyll. Perhaps then I shall understand the mystery of Dr. Jekyll's will." From that day, Mr. Utterson began to watch the door in the street of little shops when he had time. He watched it in the morning before he went to his office. He watched at lunchtime when the street was busy. He watched again at night under the moonlight. He was a patient man. And at last, at about 10 o'clock one cold night, he heard some quick steps coming towards the door. Mr. Utterson stepped into the entrance to the courtyard. The man walked quickly round the corner. He was small and was dressed in very plain clothes. Utterson could not see the man's face clearly, but he still felt a strong dislike for him. The man walked straight towards the door and took a key from his pocket. Mr. Utterson moved out and touched him on the shoulder. "Mr. Hyde, I think," he said. Mr. Hyde moved a step away, but if he was afraid, his fear quickly disappeared. He did not look at the lawyer's face, but he said quite coldly, "That is my name. What do you want?" "I see that you are going in," the lawyer answered. "I'm an old friend of Dr. Jekyll's. I'm sure that you have heard my name, Mr. Utterson of Gaunt Street. Perhaps you'll save my tired feet and give me your permission to go in with you through this door." "You won't find Dr. Jekyll at home," replied Mr. Hyde. "He's out." And then suddenly, but still without looking up, he said, "How did you know me?" "Before I answer your question, will you do something for me?" said Utterson. "Of course," said the other man. "Can I see your face?" said Utterson. Mr. Hyde seemed to think for a minute. Then he turned round and looked straight at Mr. Utterson. "Thank you," said Utterson. "Now I will know you again." "Yes," said Hyde, "and you can have my address, too." And he gave Utterson a card with an address in Soho. Mr. Utterson was surprised. "Why did he give me his address?" he thought. "Is he thinking of Henry Jekyll's will?" He didn't show what he was feeling. He put the card in his pocket and said, "Thank you." "And now I will repeat my question," said Hyde. "How did you know me?" "By description." "Who described me?" said Hyde. Mr. Utterson thought quickly. "There are people who know both of us," he said. "Who are they?" "Jekyll is one," said the lawyer. "He did not tell you about me," cried Mr. Hyde angrily. "Don't lie!" And moving quickly, he went to the door. He unlocked it and disappeared into the house. Mr. Utterson stood for a minute. Then he walked slowly away, turning a problem over in his mind. Mr. Hyde was pale and small, and he had an ugly smile. He spoke to the lawyer in a soft, broken voice, mixing politeness and rudeness. But these were not important matters. They did not explain the feelings of hate and fear that Mr. Utterson had. There was something more. The lawyer could not find a name for it. "It is something about the man, some terrible evil," he thought. "Or my poor Henry Jekyll. There is evil in the face of your new friend." Around the corner at the end of the street of small shops, there was a square of old houses. They were nearly all flats and offices now, but one house, the second from the corner, was still owned by one person. Mr. Utterson went to the door of this house and knocked. A well-dressed old servant opened the door. "Is Dr. Jekyll at home, Poole?" asked the lawyer. "I will go and see Mr. Utterson," said Poole. "Come in." He showed the lawyer into a large room and pointed to a big chair. "Would you like to sit there, sir?" said Poole. "I won't be long." "Thank you," said Mr. Utterson. He liked waiting in this room. He usually thought how pleasant it was, but tonight he could not forget the face of Mr. Hyde. It seemed to be in every corner of the room, in every moving light that burned in the fireplace. Mr. Utterson was worried and afraid. He sat and thought. He did not know what to say to his friend. Then Poole came back. Mr. Utterson was really quite glad when he said, "Dr. Jekyll has gone out, sir." "I saw Mr. Hyde go in by the old workroom door, Poole," he said. "Is that all right when Dr. Jekyll is out?" "Yes, it is usual, sir," the servant replied. "Are you sure?" said Utterson. "Yes," said Poole. "Mr. Hyde has a key." "Does he?" said Utterson. "Dr. Jekyll seems to trust that young man, Poole." "Yes, sir, he does," said Poole. "Dr. Jekyll has told us to take orders from Mr. Hyde. When he is not here, Mr. Hyde takes his place." "I don't think I have ever met Mr. Hyde here," said Mr. Utterson. "Oh, no, sir. He never comes to dinner here," replied the servant. "In fact, we don't often see him in this house. He usually comes and goes through the workroom." They were silent for a minute or two. Then Mr. Utterson said, "Good night, Poole." "Good night, Mr. Utterson," said Poole. The lawyer started to walk home. He was very sad as he thought about his friend. "Poor Henry Jekyll," he thought. "I'm afraid that he is in some sort of trouble. He was quite wild when he was a young man." Has something come back from the past to destroy him now? I hope not. So Hyde was free to come and go in Jekyll's house. That worried Utterson. If that evil man learns about the will, he thought, perhaps he will want to hurry Jekyll's death, or help him to disappear. Then he will be able to enjoy the things that Jekyll owns now. I must do something about it, if Jekyll will let me, if he will let me. Chapter 5. After Dinner. Mr. Utterson was very glad when about 2 weeks later Dr. Jekyll gave one of his pleasant dinner parties for 5 or 6 old friends. They were all intelligent men, and they all enjoyed good conversation and fine wine, so they were happy to come to the doctor's house. And as usual, the lawyer stayed after the others went home. Mr. Utterson and Dr. Jekyll sat together, one on each side of the fireplace. "I wanted to speak to you, Jekyll," Utterson began. "Oh," said the doctor. "What about?" "About your will," said the lawyer. It was clear that the doctor didn't like the subject, but he smiled. "My poor Utterson," he said, "I'm very sorry that it worries you. You worry more than anyone. Oh, except Lanyon. He seems worried about my scientific work. But he is a good man, like you." "You know that I never liked that will," said the lawyer. He refused to talk about other things. "Yes, I know that," said the doctor. You told me." "Well, I'll tell you again," said Utterson. "And I have learned something about Hyde." Dr. Jekyll's face went pale. "I don't want to listen," he said. "I heard a very bad thing," said Utterson. "It doesn't change anything," said Jekyll. "It must," said Utterson. "I'm sorry, but you don't understand, Utterson," said the doctor. "It is a very strange business, very strange. It won't become better if we talk about it. There is nothing more to say about it." "Henry," said Utterson, "you know me. You know that you can trust me. Tell me all about it. I'm sure that I can get you out of trouble." "You are a really good man, Utterson," the doctor said. "I can't find words to thank you. I trust you more than any other person. But it isn't what you think. I can tell you one thing. When I want to, I can be free of Hyde." Mr. Utterson started to speak, but Jekyll stopped him. "You should know something," said Jekyll. "I'm very interested in poor Hyde. I know that you have seen him. He told me that. And I'm afraid that he was not polite. But I do take great interest in that young man. I want to ask you to do what is right. Help him to get the things that are in my will. Can you give me that promise? It is very important to me." "I can't say that I will ever like him," said the lawyer. "I don't ask you for that," said Jekyll. He put his hand on his old friend's arm. "You are my friend. I only want you to help him when I die." Utterson looked very unhappy, but at last he said, "All right, I promise." Chapter 6. The Kairu Murder. Nearly a year later, in October 1880, there was a terrible crime in a London street. Everyone in London was shocked when they heard about it. A young woman servant saw it happen. She lived alone in a house not far from the river. At about 11 o'clock on the night of the crime, she went up to her room. She sat on a chair near the window and looked out at the moonlit streets. She was a romantic young woman, and she began to think about love. After a time, she noticed an old man with white hair coming along the narrow street below her window. Then she saw another, very small man going along the street the opposite way. This man carried a heavy stick in his hand. When the two men were quite close, the old man stopped. He seemed to ask the small man a polite question. The girl saw him pointing. She thought that he was asking the way. The moon shone on the old man's kind face as he spoke. The girl looked at the other man. To her surprise, she knew his face. He was a man, Mr. Hyde, who once visited her employer. She remembered feeling a strong dislike for him at that time. Suddenly, this Mr. Hyde became crazy with anger. He waved his stick and started shouting. The old man looked very surprised. He took a step back. And then Mr. Hyde really went mad, like a wild animal, as the girl described it later. He hit the old man over the head with his stick and knocked him to the ground. Then he jumped on the old man's body and hit him again and again with a heavy stick. He did not stop until the old man was dead. This terrible thing was too much for the girl. She fell to the floor, her eyes closed, and for some time she knew nothing. It was 2 o'clock before the girl opened her eyes again. When she remembered the murder, she immediately called the police. The murderer was not there, of course, but the murdered man was still on the ground in the middle of the narrow street. The heavy stick was broken, and one half of it lay near the body. The police looked in the murdered man's pockets and found some money and a gold watch. There was also a letter, ready to post. The envelope had Mr. Utterson's name and address on it. A police inspector brought this letter to the lawyer just before 9 o'clock in the morning. He told Mr. Utterson about the crime. Mr. Utterson listened carefully. Then he said, "This is a very serious matter, but I don't want to say anything until I see the body." "I'll take you now," said the police inspector. The body was at the police station. When Utterson saw it, he said, "Yes, I know him. This is the body of Sir Danvers Kairu." "Really, sir?" said the police inspector. "He is a very famous man." And Utterson could see the police inspector thinking, "Yes, and perhaps I'll be famous too if I catch the murderer." "Yes," said Utterson, "Sir Danvers was very famous." "Perhaps you will be able to help us in our search for the killer, sir," the police inspector said. He told Utterson what the girl saw. Mr. Utterson was worried when he heard the name of Hyde. Then he saw the broken stick, and he knew it immediately. "I gave it to Henry Jekyll personally many years ago," he thought. But he said nothing. The police inspector was waiting for Mr. Utterson to say something, so the lawyer asked, "Is this Mr. Hyde a small man?" "Yes," said the police inspector, "very small, and very evil-looking, the servant girl says." Mr. Utterson thought for a moment. Then he said, "Come with me. I think that I can take you to his house." The taxi moved slowly through the streets with Mr. Utterson and the police inspector in the back. The address on Hyde's card was not a pleasant part of Soho. The street was narrow and dirty. Between the houses there was a cheap French eating house and some small shops. Poor children in dirty clothes sat in doorways. The taxi stopped outside Hyde's house, and Utterson and the police inspector got out. Mr. Utterson knocked on the door. An old woman opened it. She had silver-colored hair and an unpleasant face, but she spoke politely and answered Mr. Utterson's question. "Yes," she said, "this is Mr. Hyde's house, but Mr. Hyde is not at home." And in answer to more questions from Mr. Utterson, she said, "Yes, Mr. Hyde came in very late last night. That's not unusual. He comes and goes at all sorts of times, and he's often away." "When did you last see him before last night?" asked Utterson. "More than 2 months ago," said the woman. "He went out one day, and I didn't see him again." "We want to see his rooms," said Utterson. "That's impossible," the woman began. Utterson stopped her. "This person is Police Inspector Newcombe," he said. An unpleasant smile came to the woman's face. "Ah," she said, "Mr. Hyde is in trouble. What did he do?" The inspector didn't answer. "Just show us his rooms," he said. The rooms had good furniture and some good pictures on the wall, but there were signs that the place was left in a hurry. There were clothes lying on the floor, but with nothing in the pockets. There were a lot of burnt papers in the fireplace. From some of the half-burnt papers, the inspector pulled out part of a checkbook. Then he found the other end of the broken stick behind the door. "Now we've got him," the police inspector said to Mr. Utterson. "We must just wait for him at the bank. He can't do anything without money." But it was not as easy as that. Police watched the bank, but Mr. Hyde did not go near it. It wasn't possible to get a good description of the man, and there were no photographs of him. People gave very different descriptions of him, but they all agreed about one thing. He looked wild and evil, and there was something terrible about him. Chapter 7. The Letter. It was late in the afternoon when Mr. Utterson went to Dr. Jekyll's house. Poole opened the door to him, and the lawyer and the servant crossed the courtyard behind the house and went into the workroom. The workroom was for Dr. Jekyll's scientific experiments. Above it, there was a large room, where the doctor had his desk, hundreds of books, and things for his experiments. On one wall of this room was a large mirror. There was a fire in the fireplace. Near it, Dr. Jekyll was sitting silently. He looked very ill. After Poole left him, Mr. Utterson said, "Have you heard the news?" "Yes, I have heard," the doctor said. His face was white. The newspaper boys were shouting it outside in the streets. "I heard them from my dining room." "Then tell me one thing, Jekyll," said the lawyer. "Sir Danvers Kairu was my client, but you are too. I want to know what I'm doing. You aren't mad enough to hide this man Hyde, are you?" "No, Utterson," said the doctor. "I promise that I will never see him again. It is all finished. I will never have any more business with him. He is safe, and nobody will ever hear of him again." The lawyer was very worried about his friend. Dr. Jekyll seemed very ill. "You seem very sure, Henry," Utterson said. "I hope that you are right. Please understand, if they catch the man, people will talk about you too." "I'm sure," Jekyll answered. "I have a good reason to be sure, but I cannot explain it. But you can help me with one thing. I had a letter. I'm not sure that I should show it to the police. You can decide, Utterson. I know I can trust you." "You are afraid that it will help the police," said Mr. Utterson. "Is that right?" "No," said the doctor. "I'm not worried about Hyde or what happens to him. I have finished with him, completely finished. I was thinking of my good name." "Show me the letter," said the lawyer. The letter was written in unusual handwriting. "Dear Dr. Jekyll, you have helped me in 1,000 ways. I am afraid that I have paid you for your kindness with some very bad actions, but you do not need to worry about me. I will be safe because I have a sure way to escape. Please forgive and forget me. Edward Hyde." Mr. Utterson liked the letter. It showed that he could worry a little less. "Do you have the envelope?" he asked. "I burned it without thinking," Jekyll answered. But the letter was not posted. I know that. Somebody brought it to the house." Mr. Utterson thought for a minute. Then he said, "If you agree, I'll keep the letter until tomorrow. I'll think about it." "Please do that," said Jekyll. "And now I have one more question," said Mr. Utterson. "Was it Hyde who wanted you to put that sentence in your will? The sentence about your disappearance?" "Yes," said the doctor quietly. "I knew it," said Utterson. "He wanted to murder you. You have had a lucky escape." "I have had something much more important," the doctor said seriously. "I have had a lesson. Oh, Utterson, I have learned a lesson." On his way out, the lawyer stopped and spoke to Poole. "Somebody brought a letter for the doctor this morning, Poole," he said. "Can you describe the person who brought it to the door?" "No letters came today," the old servant said. "Only a few that the postman brought. All bills." Mr. Utterson's fears were as great as before when he walked home. "It seems that the letter came through the workroom door," he thought. "Or perhaps it was written in the workroom. If that is true, I must be very careful." The newspaper boys were shouting in the streets of the city, "Read all about it! Sir Danvers Kairu murdered! Read all about it!" A few hours later, Mr. Utterson was sitting by the fire in his own office. With him was his head clerk, Mr. Guest. Utterson trusted his clerk. Guest often went to Dr. Jekyll's house on business for Mr. Utterson, and he knew Poole. Perhaps he also knows about Mr. Hyde's visits to the house, thought Utterson. Mr. Utterson decided to show Guest the letter, which explained some of the mystery. There was another good reason for showing Guest the letter. Guest was very clever about handwriting. "This is terrible news about Sir Danvers Kairu," Mr. Utterson said. "Yes, sir, terrible," said Guest. "The murderer was mad, of course." "I'd like to hear what you think about that," the lawyer said. "I have a letter here in his handwriting. Will you look at it?" Guest looked surprised, but said nothing. "Perhaps you are interested to see a murderer's handwriting," Mr. Utterson continued. "I'm not sure what to do about the letter. It must be a secret between the two of us. But I would like to hear your opinion about the handwriting." Guest studied the letter with great interest. "No, sir," he said at last, "not mad. But it is very strange handwriting." Just then a servant came in with a note for Mr. Utterson. "Is that from Dr. Jekyll, sir?" the clerk asked. "Yes," said Utterson. "I thought that I knew the writing," said Guest. "Is it private, Mr. Utterson?" "No, it's only a dinner invitation," said Utterson. "Why? Do you want to see it?" "Just for a minute, sir, please." And the clerk put the two pieces of paper side by side and studied them with great interest. "Thank you, sir," he said at last, and he gave both the notes back to Mr. Utterson. There was a minute of silence. Then the lawyer asked the question that Guest was waiting for. Mr. Utterson was afraid that he already knew the answer. "Why did you look at the two together, Guest?" asked Utterson. "Well, sir, in very many ways the handwriting is the same," said Guest. "That's strange," said Utterson. "Yes," Guest agreed, "very strange." "But it isn't information to tell other people," said the lawyer carefully. "No, sir," said the clerk, "I understand." And he turned and left the room. When Mr. Utterson was alone, He locked the note in his safe. "I don't understand it," he thought. "Henry Jekyll wrote a letter for a murderer!" And the blood ran cold through his body. Chapter 8. Dr. Lanyon. Time passed. Thousands of pounds were offered for information about Sir Danvers Kairu's murderer. Where was Mr. Hyde? Nobody knew. The police heard a lot about him. They heard stories about his crimes. They heard about the hate that people felt for him. But where was he? After he left the house in Soho on that morning of the murder, nobody heard of Mr. Hyde again. Mr. Utterson slowly stopped being worried, and his friend Dr. Jekyll was enjoying a new life now without Mr. Hyde. The doctor visited his old friends again, and there were dinners, drinking, and pleasant talk like the old days. On the 8th of January, Utterson had dinner at Jekyll's house with a small number of other guests. Dr. Lanyon was there, and the three of them were soon talking like old friends again. It was very pleasant. Then, on the 12th of January, and again on the 14th, Utterson tried to see his friend, but without any success. Each time, Poole answered the door. "The doctor is not able to leave the house, sir," said the servant. "He will not see any visitors." On the 15th of January, Mr. Utterson tried again, with the same result. He was worried and unhappy. What was wrong with his friend? At last, he went to see Dr. Lanyon. He thought that the doctor's servant looked worried, but the man took him in immediately to Lanyon. Mr. Utterson was shocked at the change in his friend. The usually healthy-looking man was pale and sick. He looked much older and thinner. The lawyer was sure that Lanyon was dying. But the look in the doctor's eyes was worse than this. It was a look of terrible fear, of something in the mind that was killing him. "You don't look well," said the lawyer. "Is it something serious, old friend?" "I had a shock," said Dr. Lanyon, and then he continued. "I won't get better. I have only a few weeks to live. Life has been pleasant. I have enjoyed it. But if we know everything, we are happier to live this life." "Jekyll is ill too," said Utterson. "Have you seen him?" Lanyon held up a hand that was shaking with weakness or strong feelings. "I don't want to see Dr. Jekyll again or to hear anything about him," he said. "That is very sad," Utterson said. "Can I do anything to help? We have been three very good friends, Lanyon. We are too old to make new friends now." "No," said Lanyon. "You can't do anything, Utterson. Ask Jekyll." "He won't see me," said the lawyer. "I've tried. He won't give me permission to go into his house." "I'm not surprised," was the reply. "One day soon, Utterson. After I'm dead, you will perhaps learn the true story." "Can't you tell me now?" asked Utterson. "No, I can't tell you," said Lanyon. "Now, if you can talk to me about other things, that will be good. But if you can't keep away from that subject, please go." After he got home, Utterson sat down and wrote a letter to Jekyll. He wrote, "I'm sorry that you will not see me, and what happened between you and Lanyon." An answer came the next day. It was a long and strange reply. Towards the end, Utterson read, "I agree with Lanyon. We must never meet again. I cannot tell you the reason. In future, I am going to see very few people. My door is shut to you, but you must be sure that I am still your friend. I have brought to myself a danger that I cannot tell you about. My suffering and fears are worse than I can describe. There is only one thing that you can do to help me, Utterson. Leave me alone. Henry Jekyll. Mr. Utterson could not understand the sudden change. Until a week ago, the doctor seemed happy with life again. What went wrong? Was Jekyll mad? The lawyer remembered Lanyon's words. He knew that there was no simple reason. A week later, Dr. Lanyon was in bed, and 2 weeks after that he died. Mr. Utterson was very sad about the death of his old friend. As he sat down in Lanyon's office, he opened an envelope. On it were the words, "Private, for the eyes of J.G. Utterson only." That was in Dr. Lanyon's handwriting. Inside the envelope there was another envelope. On it were more words in Dr. Lanyon's writing. "Do not open until Dr. Henry Jekyll dies or disappears." Mr. Utterson could not believe his eyes. Here was the word again, disappears. Here again, like in Jekyll's will, was the idea that the doctor could disappear. The idea came from the evil man Hyde, but here it was in Dr. Lanyon's handwriting. Utterson wanted to open the envelope and read, but he was a good and honest lawyer. He locked it in the back of his safe, unopened. He went quite often to Dr. Jekyll's house, but he did not see the doctor. Poole came to the door, but had no good news for him. "The doctor spends nearly all his time in the room above the workroom," said Poole. "Sometimes he even sleeps there. He is strangely silent, Mr. Utterson, and his servants are all worried about him." "Thank you for telling me, Poole," said Mr. Utterson. Chapter 9. At the Window. One Sunday, on their usual walk, Mr. Utterson and Mr. Enfield found themselves in the narrow street where Dr. Jekyll's workroom door was. They stopped and looked at the door. "Well, that story's finished," said Enfield. "We won't see Mr. Hyde again." "I hope not," said Utterson. "Did I ever tell you that I once saw him? And I had the same feelings of fear and hate that you described." "Everybody seemed to have the same feelings," Enfield replied. "But at the time of my story, I didn't know that this was a back way to Dr. Jekyll's house. It was silly of me." "Well, let's step into the courtyard and look at the windows," said Utterson. "I'm worried about poor Jekyll. Even if we can't go in, he will be able to hear a friend's voice." "That's true," said Enfield. The sun was high in the sky, but it was cold in the courtyard, and a little dark. The middle one of the 3 windows was half open. Utterson saw Jekyll sitting close to it. He looked very sad, like an unhappy prisoner. "Hello," said Utterson. "Hello, Jekyll. I hope that you are feeling better." "I'm not well, Utterson," the doctor answered weakly. "I'm very ill." "You stay inside too much," the lawyer said. "You should be outside, walking like Enfield and me. Get your hat and come for a quick walk with us. You will feel much better." The doctor came nearer to the window. "You are very good," he said. "It is kind of you to ask me. I would like that very much. But no, no, it is not possible. I can't go with you." "Are you sure?" said Utterson. "I'm sure," replied the doctor. "But I'm very glad to see you, Utterson. I would like to ask you and Mr. Enfield to come up, but the place is not tidy." "Then we can stay down here," Utterson said, "and talk to you." Dr. Jekyll smiled. "That is a kind suggestion," he said. But suddenly the smile disappeared from his face, and a look of terrible fear took its place. The two men below felt their blood freeze. They saw it only for a second or two, because Jekyll shut the window immediately. But it was enough. They both turned silently and left the courtyard. When they reached a busy street again, Mr. Utterson at last looked at his friend. Both of their faces were pale, and there was a shocked look in their eyes. "God forgive us," said Mr. Utterson. The two men walked again in silence.